This video is an interpretive exploration of Greek and Roman mythology. Medusa. When most people hear that name, they picture snakes for hair, a gaze that turns people to stone, and a monster who was eventually slain. But if that's all you know, you've only seen half the story. Medusa wasn't born a monster. She was once a beautiful woman. And in mythology, that beauty is exactly where her tragedy begins. Because this is a story about how someone became the most feared creature in the world, and how that transformation was never her choice. Let's go back to the beginning. Medusa was one of three sisters known as the Gorgons. Their names were Athena, Euryale, and Medusa. All three were powerful beings, but Medusa was different from her sisters in one critical way. While Athena and Euryale were immortal, Medusa was not. She carried mortal blood. That difference, small as it might seem, would end up meaning everything. Medusa lived as a priestess in the temple of the goddess Athena, and being a priestess wasn't just a job title. It was a vow, a promise to serve the goddess, to live in devotion, and to remain pure. Medusa honored that vow. She lived within it. Then one day, Poseidon, god of the sea, saw her. According to the myth, he pursued her without asking. And inside Athena's own temple, Medusa's vow was broken. This is where the story becomes deeply uncomfortable. Athena heard what happened and was furious. Her sacred temple had been violated. But here's the part that stings. Her anger didn't fall on Poseidon. He was an Olympian god, her equal in power, and moving against him directly wasn't simple. So instead, Athena cursed Medusa. This is the coldest, most unsettling moment in the entire myth. The one with power walked away unchanged. The one whose life was shattered was Medusa. After the curse, she became something unrecognizable. She was no longer someone people sought out with admiration. She became someone no one could safely approach. Her hair turned into living, writhing snakes, and her gaze became something no living creature could survive. One look, and you turned to stone. People feared her. She retreated to the edges of the world, to a barren and desolate place with her two sisters, far from any map. And anyone who wandered too close never came back. What strikes me about this is that Medusa doesn't go out hunting the world. She withdraws from it. To me, that makes her story even more tragic. She isn't simply a villain. She's someone who could no longer exist among people and had no say in becoming that way. But the story doesn't stop there. A second figure enters. Perseus was a young hero, and in the myth, a son of Zeus. One day, he found himself standing before a king named Polydectes, who gave him a mission: bring back the head of Medusa. On the surface, it sounded like a heroic quest, but the truth was darker. The king expected Perseus to turn to stone the moment he found her. It was less of a mission and more of a death sentence dressed up as one. Perseus had nothing but youth and determination. He knew that looking at Medusa directly would be the last thing he ever did. But the gods stepped in. Athena gave him a shield polished to a mirror finish and told him, don't look at her directly. Use the reflection. Hermes gave him winged sandals to fly. He was also given other tools to help him navigate safely. This detail matters more than it might seem. Perseus never looks at Medusa head-on. From beginning to end, he only sees her through a reflection. He tracks her movements in the surface of his shield, waits for the right moment, and completes his task. According to the myth, in that final moment, something unexpected happened. From Medusa's blood, the winged horse Pegasus was born, a legendary creature rising out of tragedy. Greek mythology does this. Often places anew, beginning right at the edge of an ending. But when you stay focused on Medusa herself, this isn't a redemption. Her story ends here. And then comes perhaps the most haunting part. Even after Medusa was gone, her power remained. Perseus used her head as a weapon. Enemies who glimpsed her face were instantly frozen in stone. Eventually, that head was offered to Athena, and According to some versions of the myth, Medusa's face was placed on the goddess's own shield as a symbol of protection. That detail hits hard. Medusa disappears, but her face becomes an ornament of power, fixed onto the shield of the very goddess who cursed her. Even after a person's tragedy is over, their image can still be used by those who held power over them. That's the myth. Now let's sit with it for a moment. The character everyone remembers is Medusa. She begins the story as someone admired for her beauty and ends it as something people use the word monster to describe. That's not just a physical transformation. It's a complete reversal in how the world sees a person. And honestly, that feels familiar. People get reduced to images all the time. Once a label sticks, the real story behind it tends to disappear. If you read Medusa's story from her perspective, it's a story of profound injustice. She did nothing wrong. She became the most feared creature in the world anyway. No one stayed by her side. And in the end, the person who came to destroy her was celebrated as a hero. This structure isn't just ancient mythology. It shows up in real life, too, where someone bears the weight of a situation they didn't create, and that weight becomes their permanent identity. One of the most compelling ways to read Medusa is this. She's a story about how deep wounds can transform into something that terrifies others. When pain isn't understood, people tend to call it frightening, and the idea that her gaze turns people to stone. That's symbolic in a way that resonates. Some truths are so uncomfortable, they stop people cold. Some faces carry so much weight that the people looking can't hold it. To me, that's where Medusa's power actually comes from. She doesn't strike first. She stops you before you can even move. There's another reading, too. Medusa can be seen as a symbol of long-suppressed emotion, feelings that were never allowed to be expressed, until they became something no one could get close to. And on the other side, some interpret her as someone who simply didn't fit within Athena's world of order and control, someone outside the accepted structure, who therefore had to be removed. These two readings are different, but both are worth holding. One sees Medusa as wounded. The other sees her as a threat to a system that couldn't accommodate her. And it's that complexity, the fact that she resists a single, clean explanation, that makes her so enduring. Perseus and his shield are worth thinking about too. He didn't face his fear head-on. He chose to look at it from a distance, through a reflection. To me, that shield feels like a metaphor for how we handle the things that scare us most. Sometimes forcing yourself to stare directly at something overwhelming doesn't make you stronger. It just destroys you. But when you give yourself enough distance, enough perspective, you actually begin to understand it. And that might be exactly why so many people today feel drawn to Medusa. She never really had a voice in her own story. Someone desired her. Someone punished her. Someone made her a target. But what Medusa herself felt what she wanted, what she lost, is almost always pushed out of the center of the narrative. That's why modern creators keep returning to her story and reimagining it. It's not just about updating an old myth. It's about giving a silenced person back their words. This story leaves behind some enormous questions. Who gets punished? Who gets to tell the story? Who gets called the monster? And why do certain faces end up endlessly consumed as symbols of fear? Medusa is an icon of terror, but she is also a figure of genuine tragedy. She is frightening, but she is also heartbreaking. She is dangerous, but she is also wronged. She feels ancient, and yet strangely, she feels like something happening right now. So Medusa's curse isn't simply a punishment story. It's a myth about how beauty and fear can become the same thing. It's a story about how what looks like desire can actually be power. And it's a story about how easily someone's entire life can be renamed by the way others choose to see them. Personally, I think that's exactly why she has lasted this long. She isn't remembered just because she's frightening. She's remembered because she forces us to sit with a question we usually avoid. Was the monster always a monster? Or did someone's desire Someone's judgment, someone's power make her into one. Medusa's face makes that question impossible to look away from. So when we come back to this Greek myth with fresh eyes, the image of the snake-haired creature becomes harder to hold on to as the whole picture. Behind it is the story of someone who is noticed for her beauty, destroyed because of that attention, and then locked permanently into the role of something to be feared. And that is exactly why Medusa is still alive as a legend today. She looks at us and asks behind the face, "You're afraid of what story was there?" before anyone decided to call it a monster.